Hey, what's up? This is Mark at Alchemist.camp, where usually we learn Elixir and Phoenix by building things. But today we have a question. The question comes from a viewer named Mohan, and Mohan asks, Hey Mark, thanks for all the videos. I found them pretty useful, and I've got a question. Have you used GraphQL? What do you think about GraphQL? And what do you think about the Absinthe library? That's a great question. Yes, I have used GraphQL. I first used it back in 2015 when I was a full stack JavaScript developer. And at that time, I was at a fairly small startup with just me, one other developer, and part of the CTO's time on the dev side. And we used Relay because that's pretty much what everyone was using at that time. As I recall, it was a bit of a pain getting everything set up properly with Relay, but I wasn't the one who did that. And as a consumer of the GraphQL on the front end, I loved it. I could get the data in whatever shape I wanted, and I didn't have to go back and make more endpoints or ask someone else to make an endpoint very much. So it was definitely a win, and it definitely sped things up. But in my experience since then, working on other GraphQL projects, I've come to realize that there's actually a significant cost. And that is you have to do more work on the back end. Instead of just writing out a REST API, which is really easy to do with a framework like Phoenix or like Ruby on Rails or like PHP Laravel, you've got to write another layer on top of that, which is your GraphQL schema and all the types and all the resolvers. So it is definitely more work on the back end. But the effort does scale really well as your API grows. You can reuse types. There are actually a lot of abstractions that get more and more valuable the larger your API is. As far as using GraphQL on Elixir, Absinthe is definitely the library to do it. I have used Absinthe on multiple projects now, and I am, I don't have any complaints about Absinthe. I'm a fan of the library. There are trade-offs with using GraphQL at all, but if you're using GraphQL and you're using Elixir, you would be crazy not to use Absinthe. It does a lot of work for you. Like there's not too much that you need to do in order to have errors propagated all the way from ecto validation errors or ecto schema errors all the way to your response to the front end, and that's pretty nice. It's highly performant. It's not that difficult to extend it. It gives you access to some like the blueprints, which basically just make it more extensible, more easily customized. So and it's well documented, and the maintainer is usually around on the Elixir Slack under the GraphQL channel. So it's definitely worth checking out. As far as what I would recommend as far as using it or not, I think it really comes down to how big your team is and how big your project is. I have worked myself on a project with Elixir and Phoenix and Absinthe, and then on the front end, React, Redux, and Apollo. And that was way, way too heavy of a stack for just one person. And it slowed me down quite a bit, and I don't think it was necessary at all. Basically, for every ecto schema I made, I had to write out logic in the context for it, and then I needed something in a controller, and then I also needed to write, GraphQL schemas and resolvers. And then on the front end, I needed to write a lot more code in order to consume that API. So I would say definitely Redux was a mistake. I would not do that again working on it myself. And honestly, if it, for just a single person project, I probably wouldn't use GraphQL at all, or at least not early on. I would, build it out in like a standard Phoenix app first. And then once it got bigger and once there were a lot of endpoints and it was really worth it, then I would refactor it and use Absinthe. If you do write an app with Phoenix and Absinthe, then I would say maybe don't use a full-blown front-end framework. Like just use Vue.js or something simple on the front end, and that's actually not too much more work than just a standard Phoenix app. So That's what I would say for a solo project or a very small team. But as a team gets bigger, it's more and more worth it to be saving time the people in the front end. Usually, at least for like a really interactive web app, you'll have more front end developers than back end developers. And I would say like once you get to the point where your team's big enough that you have separate people writing the Elixir as writing the JavaScript, then it's a pretty big win. And it'll actually save a lot of time. It'll cut down a lot of questions because the way GraphQL is so good about self-documenting. Absinthe does support graphical, so your app can have an endpoint that's graphical, and then people can just explore what all the queries are and what they take and try running them and seeing what comes back. So yeah, once it's separate developers working on the front end, back end, it's a huge win. I'm trying to think if there are any caveats I'd put on that. Caching can be a bit harder with GraphQL. You've got a lot more possible responses from it. There are tools that have been made to help with that. Data Loader is the main one. There is an Elixir version of Data Loader. It works very well with Absinthe. So yeah, I guess as far as the question of does Absinthe and Elixir make sense versus running Apollo server, I would say yes. You'll get better performance. It's got all kinds of advantages just from being Elixir. So that's definitely a win. Oh, and one other thing I want to throw out there. If you go to Pragmatic Bookshelf and you find the Elixir Absinthe GraphQL book by Bruce Williams and Ben Wilson, who's also the main contributor to the framework, you'll find that there's an example with a Phoenix app where it's using GraphQL and it has a GraphQL API exposed for normal users. But then there's an admin portion of the app that's just rendering standard Phoenix templates with GraphQL. And the two parts of the app work together pretty seamlessly. So there are some interesting things you can do to integrate a GraphQL API into an existing Phoenix app and still take advantage of a lot of the strengths of both. That's it for this time. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments below and they may show up in a future video. See you next time.